Hi, so my name is Anendo, and today I'm going to talk about engineering ethics and roboethics applications of surgical robots and medical device robots. So this is going to be mostly focused on surgical robots, but some type of other device will be discussed. And one example is that endoscopic pill that could be operated autonomously, but that's going to be a lit review I'll discuss later on. So next slide. So what is roboethics? It's important to define this concept before we start the presentation. So roboethics is an applied when objective is to develop scientific, cultural, technical tools that can be shared by different social groups and beliefs. These tools aim to promote and encourage the development of robotics for the advancement of human society and individuals and to help prevent its misuse against humankind. So this kind of ties also to just the purpose of making sure there's no divide as well and accounting for the human aspect. And then the other aspect and the other definition is how it's human ethics of the robot's designers, manufacturers, and users, which are generally humans. And based on the class, what we discussed, based on the book, there was a Patrick Lynn book that talked about roboethics, and there's three terms. First one is minimizing potential divide that robots create on society. And then the robots have an inbuilt presumable morality built in the code, completely independent of what the programmer programmed onto the code. And then there's the ability to self-consciously conduct ethical reasoning and be responsible for the actions. But the third term, as you can notice, this is kind of tied to another thing we discussed in class based on the David Gunkel podcast. So will-based theory and interest-based theory. To define both, will-based theory is more applies to humans as they can articulate their rights in a court of law. Interest-based theory is based on robots as they can't fully articulate their rights, and there's questions if they are a full moral agent and that they could be able to articulate their rights, which they can't. So that's where interest-based theory is more for robots. Next slide. So, and then this one is tied more towards medical ethics. So one aspect is Georgetown mantra. There's six different facets to medical ethical decisions: autonomy, benefits, non-maleficence, justice, truthfulness, and dignity. So to define them, autonomy is based on like the patient's ability to accept or reject care. Benefits is being able to be in the best interest of the patient. Non-maleficence is the idea of just not doing harm to the patient in general. Justice is in account for all the resources are being allocated to all different patients equally. And then truthfulness is to make sure there's no idea of deception and just full transparency to the patients. And dignity is just what it sounds like. It's kind of respect for the patient and the process of the medical field. And telecare is where one aspect where roboethics could come into play, where there's a doctor and he could give treatment across another country, but then there's nuanced area where he could be licensed in one country but not licensed in another. But that's where the roboethics comes into play, and different type of laws and jurisdiction laws make it difficult to give care. So, and then the other disadvantage is conflict of law, like I mentioned, and then potential for data compromise of patient data and records, given there's more people that are involved and also other patients in other countries. Data could get lost, which compromises the security of the data for the patients. Next slide. So there's engineering ethics. Now it's important to decipher for engineering ethics, and this one's based on the National Society of Professional Engineers, but there's also other organizations such as IEEE and ASME. But the six canons over here, these are from the NSP website, and these are just directly quoted from them. But there's very similar parallels to the surgeons and the medical field ethics. There's areas such as hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare. This ties kind of to utilitarianism. There's also perform services only an area of competence. That kind of ties towards knowledge base of Aristotle. There's also avoiding deception acts, which is trust, which we just discussed in medical ethics. Act for each employer or client as faithful agents. So again, that also is kind of trust. And this again, this is why I provided both to give an idea of the surgeons and engineering ethics being separate, but there are very similar parallels, which are going to be implemented in the formulation we'll talk about later. Next slide. And then the introduction. First part, presentation will have certain lit reviews that discuss current engineering ethic concerns used in design and development of surgical robots. There's going to be two that are actual scenarios where it's being implemented from design and then actually seeing the results at the end. One's like a very full design R&D process, testing, design, other ones kind of limited in scope. Those are actual cases, and then there's other ones they'll talk about general approaches, such as like Da Vinci robot, the approaches for there, and what type of suggestions people have for how the algorithms should be learning, whether it should learn from a human or whether it should learn from itself through different cases. That'll be discussed later. And another thing important to note is robot ethics and robo ethics are not the same thing. So to start, robot ethics is basically how should the robot really be acting. So this is going to be tied towards the third Asimov law, where robots shouldn't harm humans, being the first. And then second is they should refuse an action if it's immoral. And if a human says do something that's immoral, the robot should not do it. And then third is the concept of self-preservation, but that's robot ethics. Robo ethics is a little different in terms of how, at least in focus of this, the way we're going to look at is engineering type of ethics that are applied towards the design of the surgical robots. Most likely, we'll talk about Da Vinci robot as that's the most commonly used. And then the other final portion is going to be talk about virtue ethics, deontology, and utilitarianism, giving a summary of how both professions will be utilizing these concepts as part of the formulation that will be discussed. Next slide. So technical background, this is going to be really fast, not too much I'll talk about here. So capabilities is similar to a vehicle where there's level 0 being the lowest and level 5. As you can imagine, level 0 is very little involvement of the robot. Level 5 is it can almost do the assignment completely from start to finish. Some of the common procedures include colectomy, appendectomy, gallbladder removal, hernia repair. There's a lot more, but this is just limited in scope. And then, as I mentioned, Da Vinci robot's the one I'm going to be talking about very commonly, as that's the most commonly used robot, surgical robot. But it's also super expensive. It's like close to 1.5 million to 2 million. And then there's 3 facets: 2 robotic surgery controlled, automatic, and semi-automatic. And based on the name, you kind of tell that controlled is a robot's going to be controlling most aspects of that robot. Automatic is it's could handle the procedure from start to finish, or certain type of procedures by itself. Semi-automatic is Da Vinci robot is considered semi-automatic, but it involves a robot or involves a doctor given certain type of instructions, and also the robot gives certain type of feedback and loop with how the movement should be done. There's some areas where dexterity is limited for humans, so that's where these type of robots can be essential. Next slide. And then technical background, very simple about it. Once the ability to teleoperate, like I mentioned earlier on, there's also the ability to accommodate for human lacking abilities, such as dexterity, which I also mentioned before. Some aspects include also some of these robots can conduct procedures more accurately than humans. And then the fourth aspect is there's advanced AI capabilities, one being where the robot can run a whole simulation of the procedure before an actual procedure is taking place, and they could give data and suggestions based on that before the procedure is actually implemented. And disadvantages are, to put it lightly, a lot. One is very expensive overall. This is a very new concept, relatively speaking. So there's legal issues, compliance, surgical, or compliance as well. There's also concerns about different regulations, type of jobs that are going to be lost. From a robo ethics standpoint, some type of jobs could potentially be replaced. And also other aspects, mechanical breakdown, software connectivity issues during the course of an operation. And next slide. Ethical theories involved. Virtue ethics. This one's going to be Aristotle, focus on characteristics of the moral agent performing an action. So yeah, there's that aspect. There's prudence, practical wisdom, concept of eudaimonia, which is happiness. Deontology is Kant's study of duties, obligations, and morality of actions without considering the consequences or the character of the person. Typically, you don't incorporate emotions into this. There's sometimes very universal morals that are incorporated. That's one aspect of deontology, and again, it doesn't really look into consequences. Utilitarianism is focused on the right and wrong based on outcome of an action, based on the practice is generally good if it has a great net effect on the greatest number of people. And there is also an aspect where there's comparison between quality and quantity. This is more on like Bentham, where he believes that quantity defines utilitarianism, but in this one we're going to talk about it from Mill's standpoint, where we're just looking at the consequence of it. but depending on which lens you look at it, it could either be qualitative or quantitative. But this is just going to be looking at more so the outcome on the greatest amount of the people, whether it creates the greatest amount of good for the most amount of people. And then next slide. These are the Asimov three laws, and these are just quoted directly from the source that I outlined. And as I explained earlier, the first one is just not harming a human being in general. That's first priority. Second one is just if there's a immoral action or a command given by another human being, at that point the robot should not obey that command. And then the third one is it should be concept of self-preservation and just making sure it's protecting itself, as long as the first and second law is not violated. And then let's get started with the literature review. So designing robots that do not harm. And then this is the very first lit review. And then first pillar is establishing the concept of non-malfeasance. So in summary, what mirrors very similar to first Asimov law. So just like not harming the patients at all during the course of a surgery or just through designing of the robot. And then some challenges include that robots are semi-autonomous agents. So this means that the moral framework and ethics that are incorporated into that robot might not also apply to humans. Like say you're like training a child or like training a dog. It's going to be completely different for robots because the capabilities of the robot's also different. So also they're different as a moral agent as defined by David Gunkel and the third robo ethics term. And then the other aspect is to prevent harm in the first place or not acting upon a scenario that could cause potential harm. And then the book gave an example that if a robot failed to remove a surgical sponge from the incision, at that point it's equally guilty as opposed to if it didn't cause the harm or like say tore up the actual organ. They looked at it equally in the sense that just by not acting, it makes the robot equally guilty in that sense. And then the second aspect is technical aspects. So being able to preemptively identify and assess potential harm from a robot being emotionally connected to a patient. This one's being to a patient. This one's kind of a typo, but essentially one example they gave is that if a robot interacts with, say, elderly patients, and at times they could be emotionally attached. Those patients could be attached to a robot or a caretaker robot, but the situation there is that the robot should be able to identify actions that would potentially cause for that to happen, and not being able to implement those actions to avoid any chance of any emotional attachment that the patient might have. And then next slide. L2. All right. And another thing you'll notice is L1, L2, L3, L4, and L5 is going to be later on explained in the literature summary when I discuss the final findings. But for literature 2, FDA does not regulate the practice of medicine, therefore does not supervise or provide accreditation for physical training. And this kind of ties towards another challenge where if robots are tested outside of the US for certain functions, not only must these be programmed to execute difficult tasks, but they also must comply with different legal requirements in various jurisdictions. And then from a robo ethics standpoint, there's concerns of jobs being replaced. And then one specific example that the article mentioned is an approved Johnson & Johnson automated sedation system. So this has a chance of replacing anesthesiologists. At least that's a concern that they have. It's not outright gonna. Obviously, for certain professions, this can be more used as like kind of a tool or some type of way to assist. But at least from anesthesiologists, they believe that they're going to be replaced with this type of innovation, which is a concern from a robo ethics standpoint. But another aspect is okay, so these three that I underlined over here, these are the ways that some people in these articles, there's three different approaches that are approached for the Da Vinci robot, how they should be learning the movements. And one aspect is this this basically defines what a black box approach is. So essentially, the surgical robot's going to be moving autonomously, and then it's going to be recording its own internal movements through the linkages, the way the movement is. And then based on that, it's going to be measuring telemetry and performance metrics. And then based on the results of those metrics and movements to see if there's any deviation from how it's intended to be. the robot itself can conduct the failure analysis and detect what the exact problem is. That's the black box approach. And then the counterposition to this black box approach is that the Da Vinci robot should instead be learning from an actual surgeon about the movements, and then that should feed into the actual algorithm and how the Da Vinci robot should be proceeding autonomously. So this kind of ties towards the Asimov law, where it should learn from a human being and not harm a human being, but take the command of another human being before itself. And then from an engineering standpoint, engineers look at it from a risk benefit analysis, or a cost, not cost, but yeah, risk benefit. This one should be risk, but they look at it from a risk benefit analysis in terms of the fact that there are going to be risk to uh, inherent risk to using self-autonomous robots, but the benefits are going to far outweigh the small type of losses that could occur or the risk. This is tied towards the concept of utilitarianism, given that there is a cost in the sense that there might be a type of risk, but the long-term cost is going to be beneficial through developing the software. And then the author of this article believed that it's going to be similar to a driver monitoring a self-driving vehicle. So like the driver is going to be on the driver's seat and is going to be disengaging or engaging when there's either a problematic situation or something that could cause threat. That's where and then in this case of surgical robots, the surgeon's going to be coming in anytime there's any type of uh, problematic scenario that the surgical robot would conduct on another human being. Then literature 3 is going to be based on, this is the pill example that I talked about, an autonomous pill. But the study focused on end user vulnerability with a robot capsule that can deliver drugs autonomously through an endoscopic procedure. And then the article actively encouraged feedback and ethical values from different stakeholders in the process of the study, and adjusted the exposure of the testing based on feedback from stakeholders and from the risk that imposes on the end users, which is the patient. And then both metrics that are used as determining whether this procedure was successful was exposure and autonomy of the robot. So it determines to what degree the robots can be autonomous in the procedure. And also the amount of exposure, meaning how much chemicals are going to be exposed to the human while it's under the surgery or procedure. And then some ethical conclusions that are derived is constraining, limiting the scope of autonomy based on the risk it presents on patient. The conclusion determined the co-design has been successful based on identifying levels of autonomy and situational complexity. And based on that context, they could determine whether the robot achieved or did not achieve certain type of requirements. So again, this is based on situational as opposed to just good or bad or whether the project was successful. And then there was a continuous ethical evaluation post-study from the stakeholders to make sure that feedback's incorporated for future studies. And then the main story is that the autonomy of the robot should be established first and then used as a way to evaluate the success of the experiment or case study. And then L4, did it? Yeah, okay. L4, we're good. This one's very extensive in terms of this. It talks about the design, testing, a lot of different aspects of the implementing a hybrid surgical robotic system. This kind of helps more for orthopedic applications, so more for like bones. One aspect here is one engineering ethics approach involved allowing surgeons to provide accurate geometric positions and identifying and finding precise drilling and exertion points to allow more accuracy to patients. And also, this also makes sure that the patients don't get as much harm, because typically drilling before inserting the screws is less painful on the end of the patients. And that's why they believed that by having this more done autonomously by the robot, this creates less harm and less pain for the patient. And then the results of this experiment is that it met IEC 6061 standards with respect to safety and performance. To the right, you'll notice over here the factors that are incorporated in the design of this specific robot. There's professional requirements, there's business aspects, and then design aspects. So this is where it met the regulatory requirement, as I'm like where my mouse is. But then from professional, it's durability, maintainability, reliability. There's business aspect, and then the design being more on the aesthetics end. And then another aspect is the position accuracy is less than 1 millimeter, orientation accuracy is less than 2 degrees, and temperature change were less than 3 degrees. These are some of the actual findings. This is from an engineering technical standpoint, but the approach, or like the ethical approach, is to inflict less harm on the patient, which I described with making sure the exact precise drilling points are implemented and identified. And then I think I just described that over here. So the way they actually incorporated engineering ethics is through identifying different variable bone densities of different type of patients. Given different type of anatomical bone structures are going to have different densities, and then also the forces that are required to actually drill into those bones. That's why they had to analyze different type of samples, and that's how they were able to identify accurately the amount of force that should be implemented towards pre-drilling and tapping process into the actual bone. And then main ethical conclusion is very successful implementation of the entire R&D process, because there's strong collaboration, mechanical, electrical, industrial, and all stakeholders throughout the whole process. And at the end, this got approved by the Hong Kong government. So this was a success all around. And this is similar to the endoscopic pill, where both had a lot of stakeholders involved, and both were kept in the loop quite frequently. So in that sense, both projects were successful. And then literature 5. This ties to the Framingham heart study. So essentially in the Framingham heart study, the project encompasses of uh, this was a study based on heart risks and for risk for stroke, and this was done in the 1950s in Framingham, Massachusetts. So what ended up happening is in this project, they got a certain type of cohort, about 5,000 samples at the time at 1950. But the main concern is that it doesn't account for data for underrepresented communities. So at the time at 1950, the demographics were 96% of European descent and 4% non-European descent for 1950 onwards. But it is also important to make clear that this project is ongoing. So even 2024, 2025, this study is going on in the city of Framingham, Massachusetts. But to give a little bit breakdown of demographics, around the year 2000, 2021 is where there was the biggest change. At that point, it was 81% Caucasians, and then 19% of other demographics. So it gave a little bit of a difference in terms of how much data is being implemented and the variability and the demographic data. And then the current population demographics of 2025 is going to be about 60% of European descent, meaning Caucasians, and then 40% being other ethnicities, and it counts for difference such as Asian, Hispanic, Latino, other race categories. But long story short, right now it's 60 to 40%, but the main concern here is even with an increase and diversity of the sample population, the fact that most of the testing occurred in the 1950s onward to about 2000s. 2000s is when I mentioned that there's a difference in the demographics. Just given the fact that it took this long for a lot of the population to be incorporated, there's about 50 years of data that are skewed and doesn't account for a lack of diversity. So this is where the data accuracy might not be exactly indicative of what actual heart risks associated for different underrepresented communities. So again, the main story here is, or the main lesson is that there's inherent, there's statistical biases and algorithmic biases that occur for the softwares that are used in surgical robots and in just medicine in general. There's one study that used it, and I'm going to talk about it here. So there was one that discussed the risk of coronary heart disease used an ANN system to predict risk of chronic coronary heart disease. And then this was based on 42,540 data instances and 15 risk factors. And this was based on the framework of the Framingham Heart Study. But it's important to note this specific test that I described, this occurred in 2023, 2024, and this is still accurate in terms of this is one of the most, this is kind of the gold standard for assessing heart risks within the industry and heart risks and stroke risks. And through this finding, it also enhances and proves this concept through having a 96.25% validation accuracy. And then it also outperformed other test case scenarios that are very similar in this plan. And then, and then, and then the other aspect also in just uh, surgical data is that there are inherent biases in the algorithm. Some of these, it's called algorithmic processing bias. And what this does is it has those biases to be able to deal and mitigate future biases that occur within the actual algorithm. So these are going to be kind of harder to mitigate because they actually they don't serve a function, but they're inherent and there's no way to actually remove those biases. And in some way, they do have some form of purpose of not to mitigate other type of biases that are within the software. And then next literature review, or this is the summary, but I think I kind of summarized some of those during the course of explanation, but the first literature review talks about just baseline laws that robots should follow to avoid harming other entities that they're intending to protect and serve, which are humans generally speaking. And then the second literature review established the fact that manufacturers and designers must account for ethical challenges and technical objectives in aligning with legal compliance in other countries and jurisdictions. And then by implementing robots in other jurisdiction, technically L5, which I described with the sample biases that are occurring, or not sample, but data biases, it could in theory be addressed, but the challenges of different regulations can make this a challenge because some places might not allow for testing of robots. The robot status might be of concern, so it might not actually even be allowed to do that study in those type of countries. And then second literature review addresses different viewpoints regarding how the Da Vinci robot should be learning info from, and I underlined those where one should be based on learning from an actual surgeon, and then the other one's based on recording data itself based on the black box approach. And then the other aspect is the differences are between L3 and L4, the autonomous endoscopic pill and the hybrid orthopedic surgical robot. Both were successful in terms of they were both successful and achieved what they were measuring and the metrics they were used to assess success. And both projects met that requirement. But the difference is hybrid was much more encompassing of the design, testing, also the quality aspects as well. And it was much more comprehensive and also there was much more, but the endoscopic pill is much more limited in scope. So long story short, between those two projects, R&D is much more, or the hybrid dot is much more large scale testing, but then the endoscopic one is a lot much more short term scope of testing. But again, they both were successful in their end goals and end objectives. And then for L5, the Framington study, that was just more of awareness of the fact. And this is an area that's going to be further research and study. But I'm not going to be talking about this as I've talked about this in another video in areas that this could be mitigated through ethical approaches from utilitarianism, deontology, and Aristotle. And then question that has arisen from L5 is how will the data of underrepresented population be obtained through different areas of the world with different regulations? And then also, how will the data be able to achieve without violating the moral worth principle in accordance with Kant's deontological perspective? And then again, this one was kind of answered in the other video. So next slide. So this one's going to be a situational application and formulation. So the scenario here is Da Vinci robots are generally out right now in level 0 and level 1 autonomy, but to get this to level 2 capabilities where a surgeon doesn't need to actually be present during the Da Vinci robot or pressing any buttons, there's certain areas where the Da Vinci robot can do the procedure itself. This is going to be from a design standpoint and communication with the surgeon. This is where I'm going to discuss, and I outlined a specific formulation, but I'm going to read this off. And yeah, so basically the first part of the Robo ethics term about the instruction in the code algorithm incorporates Asimov's first law to protect the well-being of humans and preventing the divide among human beings, which aligns with Asimov's first two laws. And then based on the second term of robo ethics incorporating all 6 pillars of the Georgetown mantra. And then also the other aspect is the engineering ethics. So IEEE, uh, ASME, and then other engineering ethics standards. Those are going to be hard coded into the software to ensure that there's uniformity there. So both the surgeons and the engineering ethical are going to be second part in terms of with respect to first robots, and then it's going to be engineering ethics from a hierarchy standpoint. And then on the third aspect, there's from an engineering design standpoint that incorporates ethical concepts. This needs to be safeguards in place and a means of communication with the surgeon during the duration of the surgery. So an example is kind of similar to like a manufacturing robot where say a FANUC robot exists and it does a pick and place operation of like a car seat, or it could be any component, but say there's a worker that's way too close to the machine and it could cause some harm to that worker. So in that situation, in most situations, that robot would stop. It would not engage. It would not continue. So this similar type of approach can be used in surgical robots where if it was ordered to run a code from start to finish, if it doesn't feel that it could do it safely, there should be measures that it could stop in that situation and then wait on the surgeon to make a decision whether or not to engage again. And then, yeah, so surgical robots, an example, a specific example that could be given is if there's a geometry pattern of certain organs in anatomy that might be completely different than how it is accustomed to within just the human. Uh, when doing this through surgeries in the past, if there's any differences in how the geometry patterns are different, or there's more constraints, or say there's bleeding into the organ that hasn't been detected before, at that point the robot can just stop and then ask the surgeon, hey, hey, I noticed there's a discrepancy when how we approach this. What should we proceed with? Because there is a bleeding here. Should we address the bleeding first? This is going to be a different surgery than what the plan is. At that point, the surgeon will be able to decide whether or not they want to proceed. This could also, the communication could also be implemented through Industry 4.0 and 5.0, where there could be text messages that are given to the doctor's phone, or it could be through like a remote computer. So real time, similar to automated emails you get from companies or say your bank, there should be ways where through that surgical robot, there could be automatic updates anytime there's discrepancies, or an automatic email of that sort that'll inform the surgical robot, or not surgical robot, but the surgeon how to operate or how to proceed in the procedure. Also, the specific implementation will have the surgeon's code, and then it'll compare with the historical data for the procedure. And anytime there's any type of discrepancies, it'll stop the robot from proceeding. And then in that situation, it'll flag it as there's a discrepancy. And at that situation, the surgeon can decide whether or not they're going to continue from start to finish. And then also, and then another aspect is if the robot finds that the main physician hasn't seen the text or the email notification, the algorithm should have a way to decide or see if that actually has occurred. In that situation, if the robot or the physician's not accessible for whatever reason, then other type of credentialed doctors that could perform that operation is going to be contacted. There should be ways where they could also get updates. And then at that situation, if nobody is present to actually see the operation, at that point, it's going to stop only if it's safe for the patient that the robot's going to stop the operation for who knows. It could be half an hour, it could be an hour, but it's all based on context. If it causes imminent harm by stopping, then it ties to the third term of robot ethics where it would exercise some ethical reasoning of self-consciously and proceed in a manner to complete the surgery before all the data is available. That's adhering to the 6 principles of the Georgetown mantra. And also, from an engineering standpoint, that's not going to be incorporated into this aspect because at that point, the robot is just going to be mostly aligning with the surgeon, whatever the code is aligned. So the third robo ethics term is going to be mostly aligning with the Georgetown mantra of trust, benevolence, autonomy, trust, dignity, technical error, sorry. But again, that is going to incorporate of those 6 principles as I've just outlined. And then next slide. Application in accordance with virtue ethics, deontology, and utilitarianism. So, in a nutshell, on that specific case scenario, the ethical approach starts with robo ethics. So, ethical approaches for surgeons, engineers, designers, humans, and then robot ethics, which is Asimov's third laws. Those are hard coded into the software, and that's first priority. And then chart below compares how the 3 theories above are applied from the lens of the surgeon and the lens of the engineer. So the left is the lens of the surgeon and how they'll analyze it from these theoretical concepts. So deontology for Kant, utilitarianism for Mill, and Aristotle virtue ethics, practical wisdom for Aristotle, and eudaimonia. This is the concept of happiness, or at least what Aristotle defines as happiness. So from a deontological standpoint, it's both surgeon and engineers have similar based on their engineering ethics and medical ethics, they have similar idea of not harming and informed consent. And same with engineers, it's duty to design safe, ethical robots. And this is again kind of self-explanatory in that sense. We're just not harming the patient in general. Utilitarianism, from a surgeon standpoint, is choosing tools and surgical strategies that minimize overall risks. And then for an engineering approach, it's going to be designing for maximum social health benefits from across demographics, age, gender, and minimizing overall statistical probability of death of human beings. So this kind of addresses some of the concerns of the Framingham Heart Study. So that's where engineers are going to approach it from ways where it's going to not incorporate those type of algorithmic biases into the design, and also incorporating where there's other underrepresented data that could be used into the framework of the actual software algorithm. From a virtue ethics, it's kind of very similar, where there's kindness, compassion, wisdom, honesty that are exercised by the surgeon throughout the surgical process. For the engineers, it's the same concept with how they're designing honesty, wisdom, generosity, and courage in terms of how they're going to design the product. And if there's any questions about what design is implemented, why they're implementing this, there's going to be a form of transparency and making sure everyone's in the loop pertaining to how the design process is. And then practical wisdom. So within the course of the surgeon, when they're conducting the surgery, they're going to have practical knowledge and wisdom in how to uh, react in real time with unprecedented scenarios in that surgery. So if there's times where there's a lot of stop and go of the robot, they're going to be prepared to deal, and they'll know at what points of the surgery typically the robot's going to ask the doctor to decide how to proceed. For engineers, there's going to be long-term risk benefit design decision making when designing surgical robots, and this is encompassing of different type of engineering. So it's mechanical, robotic, software, algorithm, data, statistical engineering, all different sides. Then eudaimonia is just a concept of happiness from a life's purpose standpoint. Aristotle basically considers eudaimonia mostly based on uh, the entire lifetime as opposed to something that's short term. So from a surgeon standpoint, they could have a sense of eudaimonia just through making the life of patients easier. Sometimes there's areas where the surgeon might not humanly be able to be of best assistance compared to a robot. So in that sense, they're bringing a sort of happiness by fulfilling a need for a patient. And from a engineering standpoint, by making designs that benefit human society, that could bring a form of job satisfaction. And aside from just a job and a paycheck, it could be used just as a life purpose and something that gives them a sense of fulfillment in that sense. So that's where it ties to eudaimonia, that area. And then next slide. And then this is just a very large scale application of robo ethics in general. So there was one area where, as mentioned in L2, I believe. So there was one where there's a concern if anesthesiologists are going to be replaced with this through the use of surgical robots. And one area, one way that this could be addressed is for both the bioethics committee, and then also there's a committee for surgical robots and different stakeholders that are involved in the process. In the course of designing the surgical robots, they can talk about their differences for the software and then try to find some form of agreement and compromise. And also, from the end of the surgical robots, they could find ways to make sure that say for anesthesiologists, they are incorporated into the loop of the surgery so that they're not outright being replaced or given the impression that they're going to be replaced uh, within the course of a procedure. And this could this is not just limited to anesthesiologists. This could apply to other aspects, such as other areas of the job, such as sometimes record keeping uh, within the hospital, making sure that all different type of jobs and professions are kept in the loop, or found ways where the robot could actually be used as a way to enhance human growth and development as opposed to compromising or causing divide through the job loss. And in situations of job loss, some of those workers, especially if they're age of 50, 60, it's going to be hard for them to find jobs in other areas if they worked 20, 25 years in that specific profession. So that's another concern where just simply people losing their jobs, they might not be able to find jobs again. It's not just this very simple approach of, hey, the robot is making lives easier and more accurately. It's going to have a real time effect on human growth in that aspect. So, long story short, a sense of cross communication between different type of stakeholders and trying to find common ground and ways to make sure everyone's in the loop and involved is one way where from a robo ethics standpoint it could address some of the problems and challenges that are encountered. And below are going to be the references that are used. So there's a total of 13. uh, Again, these are all the references that are used in order on the presentation. And yes, this is the end of my presentation. I'd really like to thank everybody for taking the time to watch my video, and also uh, hopefully this was very informative and you really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.